December 13th, 1944, a frozen field north of the Wahlerscheid Crossroads on the German border, Technical Sergeant Clyde Dugan is flat in the snow, mortar shells tearing up the ground around him, and tracer fire cutting overhead low enough to clip the wire he's crawling under. Somewhere ahead of him is a row of concrete pillboxes, part of the Siegfried Line, and behind that row of pillboxes is a road junction that barely shows up on most maps of the war. Wahlerscheid. Nobody fighting for it that week knew that in 3 days, the entire German army was about to launch its last major offensive of the war, a few miles from where they were lying in the snow. This is the story of the 2nd Infantry Division, the Indianhead Division, and it's a story in 2 parts that most tellings of this war never connect. The first part is a fight in a forest most Americans have never heard of, and over a crossroads most military histories treat as a footnote. The second part is what that same division did 4 days later when the German army sent one of Hitler's most trusted armored divisions straight at them, expecting to roll through. It's what the German officers commanding that division wrote afterward, once they understood what had actually happened to them, is the part of this story most people never get to. The Hürtgen Forest Campaign, by December 1944, had already been grinding for nearly 3 months. American commanders had been pushing through 70 square miles of dense fir forest along the German border since September, and chasing an objective that mattered more than the trees themselves: the Roer River dams, which the Germans could open at will to flood the valley below and strand any American force that had already crossed. The 2nd Infantry Division's part of that campaign in December was to seize the Wahlerscheid Crossroads and push toward those dams through the northern edge of the forest. It was brutal and grinding infantry combat against German positions dug into concrete and wired in with the kind of density that made every yard cost blood. And this channel exists to tell the parts of this war that get skipped over between the famous battles, and this is one of the clearest examples of why that matters. If you're finding this for the first time, stick around and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. By December 15th, after 2 days of fighting through wire and pillboxes in weather cold enough to freeze wounds shut, the 2nd Infantry Division had taken Wahlerscheid Crossroads. It was a costly, unglamorous fight over ground that on any ordinary week of the war would have simply become one more line in the division's after-action report, and nothing more. That week wasn't ordinary. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16th, while the 2nd Infantry Division was still consolidating its gains at Wahlerscheid, and the eastern horizon lit up with an artillery barrage, the likes of which the American line hadn't seen since Normandy. It was the opening bombardment of what the world would come to call the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, and the men holding Wahlerscheid at first assumed it was simply a reaction to their own attack on the dams. It wasn't. It was the beginning of an assault built around some of the most experienced and heavily equipped armored divisions Germany had left, aimed directly at the ground the 2nd Infantry Division and its neighbors were standing on. Within hours, orders came down that reversed everything the division had just spent days fighting for. The attack toward the dams was over, and the 2nd Infantry Division was now being pulled back from ground it had just bled to take, and sent instead to hold a ridge line most of its soldiers had never heard the name of before that week: Elsenborn. What was coming for them there was the 12th SS Panzer Division, a unit built, quite literally, out of the Hitler Youth movement, led by officers who had cut their teeth on the Eastern Front and given one of the most important jobs in the entire German offensive. At 7:30 on the morning of December 17th, Major General Walter M. Robertson, commanding the 2nd Infantry Division, received an order that reversed everything his men had spent the last several days fighting for. Pull back from Wahlerscheid, retreat southwest to the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath, 7.5 miles away, and dig in. The division that had just bled to take a crossroads on the German border was now being asked to do one of the hardest things an infantry force can attempt: retreat in good order while an enemy offensive was already rolling toward it. Without turning that retreat into a collapse, Robertson's plan for it was almost mechanical in its precision. Forward battalions would pull back through reserve positions, which would become the new front line in their place, and those units would in turn hold long enough for the next wave to fall back behind them. A leapfrog withdrawal design so that at every moment there was still an organized American line facing the Germans, never an open gap. It worked, but only barely, And only because the men holding each link in that chain understood that if their position broke, the whole withdrawal broke with it. And what was coming at them down the roads into Rocherath was the spearhead of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Tanks with SS Panzer Grenadiers riding on the decks, moving fast on the icy roads, carrying searchlights that bounced light off the low clouds to give their infantry visibility at night. By the evening of the 17th, German armor had already plowed through elements of the 2nd Infantry Division that had arrived in Krinkelt only moments before, and reinforcing men from the 99th Infantry Division who had been fighting since dawn. The 38th Infantry Regiment held anyway. And the German advance stalled hard enough at the edge of Krinkelt that the German commander pulled his tanks back for the night rather than risk running them into what he judged might be a stronger force than his own. A hesitation that likely saved the American position from collapsing outright. And that night, an optimistic message went back to headquarters from officers in the 2nd Division. Action quieting, believe we can hold. It would prove to be a false hope. And the fighting through Krinkelt and Rocherath over the following day became some of the most brutal close-quarters combat of the entire Ardennes campaign. American bazooka teams engaging German tanks at ranges of a few dozen meters in village streets, artillery called in on positions close enough to threaten the men calling it, entire platoons cut off in individual buildings and fighting alone until relief arrived or didn't. By December 19th, the withdrawal Robertson had planned was complete. And the 2nd Infantry Division, along with the battered remnants of the 99th, had pulled back onto the high ground behind Krinkelt Rocherath, a ridge line running along the villages of Elsenborn and Würzfeld that American engineers and artillery had spent 2 days reinforcing while the infantry bought them the time to do it. It wasn't a retreat in the sense of giving up ground and calling it done. It was a controlled fallback onto the one piece of terrain that let American artillery, dug-in tank destroyers, and infantry with clear fields of fire finally stop trading space for time and start simply holding. The 12th SS Panzer Division, one of the most heavily equipped formations Hitler had left in his order of battle by the winter of 1944, now had to attack directly into that ridge to keep the entire northern half of the German offensive on schedule. It's what its own commanders wrote about what happened next, in reports that survived the war and eventually made their way into Allied and post-war German historical archives. On December 17th, with his lead divisions taking heavy casualties and still not through the American line, Sepp Dietrich, commanding the entire 6th Panzer Army, made the call to commit his reserve early. He sent SS Colonel Hugo Cross and the 12th SS Panzer Division forward against Robertson's flank. Even though the breakthrough it was supposed to exploit hadn't happened yet. It was the kind of decision an army makes when the schedule is already slipping, and there's no room left to wait for a cleaner opportunity. It didn't go the way Dietrich needed it to. Most of the division's tanks bogged down in the mud on the approach. By the time they got moving again that night, they managed to push briefly into Krinkelt, only to be thrown back out by an American counterattack, so scraped together in a matter of hours. The next morning, and Tiger tanks from the 12th SS pushed into Rocherath and were driven back again, this time by artillery fire from the ridge above them, by bazooka teams and anti-tank mines, and in at least a few documented cases, and by American soldiers pouring gasoline over disabled German tanks and setting them alight rather than let the crews recover them. And not what survives from the German side of this fight isn't a single dramatic quote from an SS officer admitting defeat. And it's worth being straightforward about that instead of pretending otherwise. What survives instead is something arguably more revealing in the paper trail. As the days passed and Elsenborn Ridge still hadn't fallen, and orders from Field Marshal Walter Model and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt came down the chain of command to Cross's headquarters with what surviving records describe as increasing urgency. The ridge must be taken. The advance of the entire 6th Panzer Army must resume. General Hermann Priess, commanding the corps above Cross, put him in charge of every German unit facing the ridge and gave him one instruction: capture it. And those are not the words of a command structure that believes the job is going well. They're the words of a command structure watching its own timetable collapse in real time and demanding, over and over, that the men on the ground fix it anyway. That gap between what a panzer army wanted to be true and what its own soldiers were actually finding on that ridge is exactly the kind of detail that gets lost when a war gets compressed into a highlight reel. If this is filling in a piece of the picture you hadn't heard before, that's the point of this channel. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. They never fixed it. Between December 16th and 19th, the 12th SS Panzer Division and the units alongside it, through repeated armored and infantry assaults at a line held first by the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions in the villages, and then by both divisions dug in on the ridge itself, and reinforced by tank destroyer battalions and a growing weight of American artillery that had the range and the ammunition to make every approach to Elsenborn a killing ground. By the time the fighting in this sector wound down, and German losses across the whole battle for Elsenborn Ridge ran to roughly 5,000 men killed or missing, and well over 100 tanks destroyed, against a defense that never gave up the high ground it was ordered to hold. Elsenborn Ridge is recorded in the official U.S. Army history of the battle as the only sector of the entire American front line during the Battle of the Bulge where German forces failed to advance at all. Everywhere else along that front, the German offensive tore through and bent the line and places broke it completely. Here, it didn't, and the reason it didn't traces back through the fighting in Rocherath and Krinkelt, and back through the leapfrog withdrawal that got the 2nd Infantry Division onto that ridge intact instead of scattered. Back to a division that had spent the days just before the Bulge began bleeding for a crossroads most people have never heard of, in a forest most people only associate with a different, later fight entirely. That's the answer this story has been building toward across 3 parts. In the 12th SS Panzer Division, didn't leave behind a quote about the 2nd Infantry Division the way some units did about other American divisions elsewhere in this war. What it left behind was a stalled timetable, a field marshal's demands that kept arriving and kept going unanswered, and a ridgeline east of a small Belgian town that the German army, for all its armor and all its urgency, simply could not take.